Hello and welcome to the next in the series of the Meet the Employer webinars, bringing you exclusive access to inside information from a wide range of employers. This series is run in partnership with Graduate Recruitment Bureau, the UK's leading recruitment service for entry-level careers. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Katie Hildyard, your host for the series, and I'm delighted to be joined by Professor David Viner from Macquarie Capital. David is going to showcase Macquarie's green credentials and leadership and give really valuable insight into what Macquarie does in this space. Coming up, you can expect to hear David's top takeaways for people interested in working in the financial sector, so make sure you stay tuned. Before we get started, some very quick housekeeping. We'll aim to keep the webinar to around 25 minutes, and if you experience any technical difficulties, don't worry. A copy of the recording will be made available on the Macquarie profile in your online career platform. On the slide, you can see a small sample of the type of webinars we have in the series, and we have a growing number of employers confirmed. Full details can be found in your online career platform. So without further ado, I shall pass you over to David.
Hi there, everyone. Thank you, Katie, and thanks for this opportunity to talk about Macquarie Capital and our role in the transition of the global society to a greener, cleaner, more resilient world. I've only just joined Macquarie. I've been on the date of doing this webinar 6 weeks. That's 6 weeks after spending 30 years entirely working in the area of climate change. I've spent that time working across academia, the UK public sector, and more recently the private sector, working for a large civil engineering company. I'm now working for Macquarie Capital, an investment bank, the world's largest infrastructure investment bank. So what am I doing here? I'm not a banker. I've not got an economics degree. I'm fairly rooted in the belief that I'm a geographer. But over my time working in climate change, a lot has happened. We know there's a great deal of scientific evidence being published on climate change, and we know that's robust. When I started let's just say, a long time ago, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, had just published its first assessment of state of the climate science. I'm a coordinating lead author for the current IPCC 6th assessment report. We know an awful lot. We know what's happening. We know the global temperature is rising and rising at a rapid rate, probably more rapidly than any time in human history, and we know the causes of it. And we know that if we don't do anything about it, the climate system will warm very dramatically. We're looking at least 1.5 degrees warming by 2040, maybe earlier, and as high as 3-4 degrees by the end of the century if we don't do anything about it. We know that the impacts of climate change are costing a great deal of money. This is work put together by Munich Re. We know that there's been a huge increase in the cost of natural disasters around the world, and that these are likely to exceed $1 trillion within 20 years. So unless we start to understand the risk we face from climate change, we're not likely to build resilience. And I'll talk about that a bit in a minute. But in terms of where we are and what we're seeing, we've seen changes all around the globe. People are seeing this at first hand. It's not a case of what's going to happen in the future, it's a case of what's happening now and also in the past. We know some of the major climate events we've seen. The European heat wave of 2003, for example, killed maybe up to 75,000 people in Europe. Put that in context of where we are now in the present day. We saw the European heat wave of 2011 kill many tens of thousands as well. And across the world, natural disasters driven by climate change, bushfires in Australia, extreme rates of warming in Siberia and in the Arctic Circle that we're seeing at the moment are unprecedented. They go beyond our records and they go beyond our understanding. In fact, many of the changes that we're seeing now are increasing at a faster rate than even the most pessimistic models have said. So we've got to look at what's happening. We've got to look at what we can do to address this, and we've got to use this science to help underpin what we're doing at Macquarie and what we're doing for our clients and what we're doing for our communities and stakeholders, and how that will benefit not just Macquarie as a whole, but everyone that we deal with and further afield as well. Those impacts of climate change are going to be dramatic. Coral reefs are one of the key indicators of what we're seeing and where we are seeing those impacts. We know that in the recent global heat waves that we've had, many of the world's coral reefs have been decimated by the impacts of climate change. And it's likely that if nothing is done in the next few years, we're going to see coral reefs become unsustainable around the world. The IPCC, as I mentioned, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has assessed vast amounts of evidence. It's probably the most robust scientific assessment of any discipline there is. Many thousands of scientists contribute to the production of the reports. Many thousands more review those reports and the content of the reports. And the world governments agree on the final content and the final statements. So it goes through a very thorough review process. The scientists critiqued all the way. The authors have to ensure that the science they're using is robust and credible. And that helps to then inform the climate policies that are taken at a global level. So one example of this is what happened in Paris in 2015 when the world government agreed to limit emissions of greenhouse gases to levels which will prevent dangerous climate change. This figure here, what we call the burning embers in IPCC world, demonstrates what that means. We have identified that if the temperature of the world rises above 2 degrees, we move into dangerous climate change. So this guardrail highlights where certain systems will move into areas which will be devastating and impacted badly by climate impacts. So we know around, for example, if the global temperature hits about 3 degrees Celsius, over 400 million more people will be exposed to crop losses. If we know if the global temperature rises above 3 degrees, permafrost is likely to collapse. The heat wave in Siberia is indicative of that. Once that happens, the permafrost melts. That not only results in land loss, but also the release of vast amounts of stored historic fossil methane and carbon dioxide that is locked up. That will even enhance the rate of climate change further. We know that infrastructure will suffer. Much of the world infrastructure is built for today's conditions. We at Macquarie understand that, and we're looking to see how we can invest in infrastructure that is really resilient for the future. But we can see that in the impacts of climate change on cities, communities around the world that are affected by drought, affected by sea level rise and storm surge. So we know what dangerous climate change looks like. The world has agreed to try and limit emissions to prevent dangerous climate change, and if possible, go even further. We want to try and limit emissions to stop the global temperature rising above 1.5 degrees Celsius. Bearing in mind that we're already at 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial, we only have a very small headroom now for which we can adjust our systems so we can prevent dangerous climate change happening. So when we understand climate impacts, we have to look at what resilience is and what that means. So there is a standard definition of resilience that's widely used and widely understood. It's the capacity of a system to absorb the stresses imposed by climate change and respond and evolve into a more desirable state that will improve the robustness of the system, leaving it in a better state to withstand not only the increasing impacts from climate change, but also other external shocks. So putting that simply, if we build resilience to climate change, we can put in place systems that when a climate impact happens, that asset, be it a small shop, be it a substation, electricity substation, be it a city or a country, we know that it might have the initial impacts from the event, but it will respond quickly and it will have the systems in place that will enable it to move quickly. One example of this is what we saw in the early 2000s with Hurricane Ivan. Hurricane Ivan battered Grenada, decimated the infrastructure of Grenada, and as a result of that, Grenada was very, very badly affected. Its economy suffered, its tourism industry suffered, but neighbouring islands that were more resilient and more aware were able to respond quicker and took advantage of the fact that less tourists were going to Grenada, so they'd go to nearby islands. So building resilience and adding resilience adds value to assets. So we know what causes climate change. It's increasing concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Climate risk is a measure of that impact. We know climate risk is made up of three major factors: the hazard, so that's the weather event, the climate event; the exposure of maybe an asset or a city, or an individual. How close is that city to the sea? How close is that substation to the floodplain? Is the floodplain on station? How many people live in that floodplain? That categorises exposure. And then the vulnerability of those assets, communities and systems. How often how much money is being spent on repairing and maintaining sea defences? What's the operational lifetime of assets? So all this makes into built a risk equation where how we can understand climate risk. But we know that risk isn't static. We know that changes over time. Even with our best efforts, the hazard component of the risk equation will increase, but with other adaptation resilience measures, the exposure might decrease, the vulnerability may decrease, so overall the risk may decrease. So we have to be very aware of what's happening within the interaction between hazard, exposure and vulnerability in order to understand climate risk. And we can do that in a quantifiable manner, or we can do that in a qualified way. So it doesn't really require vast amounts of computing infrastructure or vast amounts of mathematics or economics. It can often be done by expert judgment and by those who have a thorough understanding of what climate change means and what's likely to happen in the future. In terms of where we're going, I've mentioned about the desire to keep global temperatures below 2 degrees and if possible 1.5 degrees. So what does that mean? We know what our historic emissions of greenhouse gases are. If we carry on doing what we're doing now, and the current policies, we will hit 3 to 4 degrees of global warming. That is way above the dangerous threshold. If we do what the world government's committed to doing at Paris, we'll see climate change in the region of about 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, still above dangerous climate change. If we are to get down to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial, we need to peak emissions now, not 10 years in the future or 20 years into the future, but now, at this very present time, and then see a rapid reduction in emissions over the next 20 to 30 years, moving into what we call net negative by the middle of this century. There's very little flexibility in this. The longer we leave it, the more we hesitate, the more we dither, the more we don't take action, the higher the impacts will be, or the more rapidly decarbonisation will have to be. And there's costs associated with both of those, and we have to understand what those costs mean. Climate change isn't new. We've been discussing this, and I've been discussing it as part of my career over the last 30 years. Before that, in the 80s, it started to become news. Jim Hansen set the scene going with a presentation to US Congress. Before that, my former colleagues at the Climatic Research Unit had put together the global temperature curve, which showed the world warming. And before that, in the 1950s, Keeling put in place the carbon dioxide curve and the carbon dioxide measurements from Mauna Loa and Hawaii showing carbon dioxide increasing. Before that, in the early 1900s, Svante Arrhenius, a Swedish geographer, postulated that because the world was burning coal, concentration of carbon dioxide would be increasing, and that would have an impact on global temperature. And he estimated that we doubled CO2 just by observing and analysing the limited evidence he had that the climate system would warm by 4 to 5 Celsius. That wasn't far wrong. And before that, in the 1860s, John Tyndall, an Irish physician, worked out that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases had this radiative forcing on the climate system. So if you increase concentrations of those greenhouse gases, they would warm the climate system. It's not maybe or it can cause a link. It's a proven scientific, physically based mechanism. We know what's happening. We understand what's happening. We have now been able to measure the forcing factors, carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases. We've been able to measure the impact upon the global temperature, and we are seeing those impacts manifest themselves around the world. The IPCC, as I mentioned, I'm previously a political news author of, was established in 1988. It was established at the behest of the UK government and a lot of effort put in at the time by the government then to mobilise resources, scientific resources, to start the assessment process. As I said, now we're at the 6th assessment cycle. In the last few years, as part of the 6th assessment cycle, we've seen a number of special reports being published. The one highlighted here is the global warming of 1.5 degrees report, which really indicated what the impacts of dangerous climate change are. At the same time, there was another report on the impacts of climate change on oceans and cryosphere. That, again, very important in determining what was happening in the major systems of the world, the major ocean and cryosphere systems, what the rates of change were, and what the likely impacts of that change would be. So with the cryosphere, ice sheets melting, and we can have a better understanding upon the rate of sea level rise. And then in the final part of that trilogy was a special report on climate change on land, which I was a lead author on, which started to look at how land, climate and society interacted. And we know one of the major findings of that was the benefits of having a plant-based diet over a meat-based diet. So that's based upon scientific evidence. So people say, I'm vegetarian, there is a scientific basis behind that. We know the impacts of meat production, dairy production upon them. climate change. So those 3 reports are instrumental in helping frame policy. As I mentioned, the 6th assessment cycle, which will be completed next year, will help underpin the next round of major climate negotiations. We have in the UK next autumn, COP26, the 26th time, the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework on Climate Change will be meeting to discuss progress, start tracking progress and how we can measure progress on the commitments made at during the Paris Agreement. We're now in the midst of a very damaging pandemic, which is affecting all of us, affected many of the vulnerable people around the world. Those that were being impacted by climate change are being impacted as hard by COVID. We have to look around the world at a unified response to the pandemic, couple that into how we're going to respond to climate change. Prior to COVID, there was a great deal of public action on climate change. The student strikes led by Greta Thunberg, Extinction Rebellion and their campaigns across the UK, and also the policy response by government. The UK government has put itself in a very prime position of demonstrating that they want to meet the net zero challenge. We have the UK Climate Change Committee, which is holding the UK government to account. And the UK was the first country in the world to have a dedicated climate change act. Since then, many countries have copied and many thousands of pieces of legislation have been passed around the world. And this is influencing how society is operating, how society is being governed, and how businesses like Macquarie are reacting to those policy dimensions. At times, it seems a bit bleak about what's happening. But across the world, huge amounts of action are taking place, discernible action, to help mobilise the transition to net zero. Macquarie is at the heart of this. We are an investment bank, one of the largest infrastructure investment bank in the world, and at the heart of Macquarie is the Green Investment Group. And we are ensuring that our investments are green, they can be rated, credible, quantified. And we know that the uptake of renewable energy has been dramatic over the last few years. And we now know that many countries, such as the UK, are at times now weaned off fossil fuels and relying more heavily on wind, solar and other renewable forms. And the pace of this change is happening quickly. And it has to happen quickly because we're committed to the Paris Agreement, where we're committed to making sure that emissions collapse very rapidly over time. We have to ensure that infrastructure is in place to help drive this transition, but also society is ready for that, and finances are in place to help drive that transition. So we know with the uptake of renewables, we know there's cost reductions in place and that renewable technologies are very competitive compared to old traditional ones. And we know that new renewable sources such as hydrogen are coming on stream to help drive that further as well. So what does GIG do, the Green Investment Group, as part of Macquarie? Well, the Green Investment Group was formed by Macquarie's takeover of the UK government's Green Investment Bank. But we are held to account, and we appreciate that being held to account. We have 5 main green purposes that we adhere to in all our investment decisions that the Green Investment Group does. Primarily, number 1, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. 2, increase natural resource efficiency. 3, protect the natural environment. 4, protect biodiversity. And 5, to promote environmental sustainability. We are held to account because part of the government enacted legislation to put in place something called the Green Purposes Company, which oversees that green mission. They have a special share in the company, and we're not allowed to do anything without their permission and say so. So they're ensuring the commitment of the Green Investment Group only to invest in line with that green mission. And we want to do well. We want to meet that. We are committed to doing that. My appointment has been happened because we see the growth potential not just within the Green Investment Group, but right across Macquarie as a whole. And we want to lead on that green mission, and we want to lead on that green transition, and through the role of the Green Investment Group, turn Macquarie green from the inside out. So we invest in many forms of resilience around the world. We invest in many forms of low carbon, net zero emissions technology around the world. So what do these look like? These are bits of infrastructure that are being deployed, which are novel, unique, but replicable and scalable. So we are looking at working with our clients to help make them more resilient. So in Finland, we're helping the Finnish telecom system transition from overhead transmission lines to underground lines to make them less exposed to climate hazards and climate risk. In the Netherlands, we are building one of the largest moving structures to protect Rotterdam from flooding. A huge undertaking, a huge civil engineering undertaking, but one that will allow Rotterdam to continue to thrive in the future, but also ensuring that the wider environment benefits as well. And in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, we have helped build a tunnel to adapt to the threat of flash floods. So it's a tunnel that has a dual purpose. One, in normal times, it's a road tunnel, perfectly functioning. But in times of heavy rainfall, that tunnel can be used as underground drainage, underground storage as well. And then after the flood, it can rapidly transition back to a road tunnel. That's a really good example of what we're doing. So around the world, we are investing in renewable technologies, we're investing in resilient infrastructure. What we know is that the need to move to net zero is an economic, societal and environmental necessity. It's almost, it's something that we have to do. We can't afford not to do this. And Macquarie and the Green Investment Group want to be at the heart of that. The financial sector, which I'm now part of, is diverse and requires individuals from all backgrounds. I'm not an investment banker, although I work for an investment bank. As I said, I started out as a geographer. I did an undergraduate degree in physical geography, a PhD in civil engineering, but mainly related around hydrology. I spent 30 years working as a climate scientist, influencing government policies around the world and helping businesses build resilience themselves. So we want people not just from the economic side, but we want people from right across the broad spectrum of disciplines that there are. And above all, we want innovation. The biggest barrier to innovation that we have is human imagination. So we're looking for people with that innovation, with that imagination, who can think up new ideas and deliver those new ideas. We need to ensure that resilience is in place right across the supply chains, across everything we do, so that ensure that if one bit fails, the whole lot doesn't fail. So we have to have that eye on resilience and that innovation. So we're looking for graduates from a whole range of backgrounds to come and work in an organisation which wants to position itself at the heart of the green transition and the move to a net zero and resilient global society. Thank you very much, and thanks for your time.
David, thank you so much for providing such valuable insight into Macquarie's focus on green investment and why this clearly is so vitally important. I certainly hope that everybody on the webinar found this session insightful. This webinar is part of our Meet the Employer series, and to find out about others we have taking place, all you need to do is go to your newsroom on this careers site, click the webinar tab, and there you will see details of the webinars we have confirmed. We'd love to hear your feedback. So at the end of this webinar, a very short survey will pop up. If you could complete it, that would be brilliant, because we'll certainly take in your views and feedback as we plan future webinars. Thank you again for being with us, and I hope you can join us for a future webinar.